Did you know that the Crash Bandicoot series has sold over a whopping 50 million units in its lifetime? See, before Naughty Dog became obsessed with remastering The Last of Us, their bread and butter was platforming games with cute mascots. The success of Crash led to several sequels, spin-offs, and other platformers that helped build Sony's brand into the juggernaut that it is today in the gaming space. But somewhere along the lines, we lost the plot. Eventually, what was key to every console's success, the platforming mascot, became a relic of the past. Gamers grew up, and with that came the evolution of the type of experiences gamers craved from their games. But like everything else, what was once old eventually became new again, and that's how we got what many are calling a modern day classic. I'm talking about Astrobot, a game so good that Sony's rival and Super Smash Bros. Creator Sakurai had to take to Twitter to praise the game. Hi, my name's the Black Okage, aka TBH, and today I'm here to break down the rise, fall, and rebirth of the PlayStation mascot. Now there's a lot to break down here, including my thoughts on Astrobot, but before I share my thoughts on that game, let's first explore how we got here. And to understand that, well, we first need to go back to where it all began. You know, ironically, PlayStation's roots aren't actually found in Sony, but Nintendo. For those of you unaware, Nintendo's arrogance is responsible for the birth of one of their greatest rivals, and it all goes back to the 1980s. Back then, Sony dominated the market with their Sony Walkman, and they helped create the CD in collaboration with Philips. If there was anyone on the market who understood audio, it was definitely Sony at the time. And because of this, in the late 80s, Nintendo approached Sony to develop a sound chip for their upcoming console called the Super Nintendo. And that sound chip was being worked on by then Sony engineer and future PlayStation icon Ken Kutaragi. This early collaboration would go on to help the two brands build a strong work relationship for the future. Now, as the 90s approached, it was clear CD-ROM was the future of media, but there was just one problem. Nintendo had experience dealing with cartridges and cartridges only. Now, despite their lack of expertise with the CDs, that didn't change the fact that Nintendo wanted a slice of the CD pie. So in 1989, Nintendo contracted Sony to produce a CD-ROM add-on for their Super Nintendo. The codename for that CD add-on was something that might sound familiar to you all. Behind closed doors, these two were calling it the Nintendo PlayStation. As time would pass, eventually Sony and Nintendo were ready to show the world what they were working on. So in 1991, Sony made an appearance at the Consumer Electronics Show, as this was before E3, Summer Games Fest, or Gamescom existed, and this was the best place to show off the new gaming tech. It was on May 28th, 1991 at CES in Chicago that Sony proudly revealed to the world their CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo that they were calling the PlayStation. Now initially, this collaboration was met with excitement by the press. Before Sony could even pop the cork on a bottle of champagne, Nintendo did the unthinkable. The very next day, Nintendo publicly announces they'd be cutting all ties with Sony, and instead, they'd be partnering up with Philips on a CD peripheral. This announcement caught Sony executives completely off guard, as they learned about this new partnership with Philips at the same time as the general public. And from my research, there's conflicting reports on this topic. Some reports claim there wasn't a solid contract between Sony and Nintendo, but other reports claim the real reason Nintendo pulled out was due to fear. See, Sony was one of the biggest corporations in the world, and Nintendo felt Sony was a little too excited to be operating in the home console market, a space they almost exclusively owned at the time. Nintendo had a sneaky suspicion that Sony was setting up a play for themselves to eventually enter the home console market and eat into Nintendo's profits. Now, my personal opinion on this matter is, I think it's possible both things are true. Nintendo's suspicion was correct. I think we have enough evidence to suggest that, but if there was no paperwork as reported, Nintendo found a loophole to snake the company that was trying to snake them. All just speculation, of course. Who really knows? What I do know is that Sony's then president was pissed. The company had not only been humiliated, but they were humiliated by a rival on the world stage. Sony wanted revenge. So what happened next is Ken Kutaragi went to Sony's president and pleaded to have the green light on producing a home console for Sony. Ken got that blessing to make a move, and thus Sony put together a team that would focus on producing a platform capable of running CDs and advanced 3D graphics. It was only 3 years later in 1994 that Sony released the PlayStation 1 in Japan, followed by a global release in 1995. The PlayStation was revolutionary with its sleek design and use of compact discs, and the graphics were better than anything else on the market at the time as well. I know it looks goofy now, but those block boobs in Tomb Raider looked real to us back then. It was just one problem that Sony faced, and it was the fact that they lacked a mascot.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
From 1994 to 1995, from a software standpoint, I'd argue Sony just did okay. Not great, just okay. You had some decent titles like Ridge Racer, Twisted Metal, and the original Tekken, but all those were just the first entries in their respective series and hadn't really found their footing yet. Hell, the original Tekken was just a Virtual Fighter clone. That series didn't really find its footing until Tekken 2 and 3. But everything changed in 1996 when a little-known company by the name of Naughty Dog released their game Crash Bandicoot. I was only 6 years old at the time of this game's release, but I remember when Crash hit PlayStation. It was like when crack hit the 80s. It flooded the gaming streets. I was a Nintendo kid growing up, and my family was too poor to purchase 2 consoles, so most of my early experiences with PlayStation came from friends. See, back in the 90s, kids used to go over each other's houses to play games, and it was at my neighbor's house that I got to experience titles like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Final Fantasy VII, and Siphon Filter. And one thing I do recall from my childhood is that most of my neighborhood friends with a PlayStation, they owned Crash Bandicoot. And that's because Nintendo had Mario, Sega had Sonic, and now Sony had something to give PlayStation gamers a sense of identity. A sense of identity that was very important back then to both gamers and Sony alike. See, let me put y'all on game. One of the reasons why platforming games were so popular is because it was just a case of right place, right time. And because of that, they had sort of a symbiotic relationship with the corporations that owned them. Nowadays, the average gamer is 35 years old. But back then, it was mostly kids and teens gaming because gaming was still viewed as a trend for kids that would eventually fizzle out. Now, because the average gamer was a kid in the 90s, both game devs and hardware manufacturers felt they needed a cute mascot character to help generate sales. It's no secret Nintendo has Mario and Zelda, Sega had Sonic, and now PlayStation had Crash. Crash had tight controls, interesting characters, vibrant colors, a unique use of the camera when doing the running sections, fun music, and it even had charming sound effects such as... The success of Crash went on to spawn several sequels and the classic spin-off title Crash Team Racing, but more importantly, it opened the floodgate for other platformers to thrive on PlayStation. This includes my personal favorite, Spyro the Dragon, a game in which was one of the first fully open-world 3D designed games. I remember being so poor, my family would go to Circuit City and they would let me play the Spyro the Dragon demo, and let's just say that demo went triple platinum in my house. On top of that, you also had games like Ape Escape, Gex, Croc, and more, and these games were not only wholesome and fun, but they were pushing boundaries and generating hardware sales for Sony. I believe the first generation of platformers were great, and that's why some are still kicking today, such as Crash and Spyro. But I also believe that first generation of platformers walked.
Embark on an epic journey in a mystical world unlike our own. A world in search of new heroes. Heroes that stand fast in the face of evil.
I was right behind you, Jack! Really? I was.
A new legacy is born. Rated E for everyone.
So the second generation could fly. That second generation is the greatest generation of PlayStation mascots, and it's not even close. And that's because the PS2 was home to that three-headed monster known as Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, and Sly Cooper. Now, everyone has their favorite of the three, but I think we all can agree they're all classics in their own right. Ratchet was great because of the creative weapons, the level design, and the sarcastic commentary on society. Sly was great because of the tight controls, the unique stealth mechanics, and the strong supporting cast of friends. And the game, it just had this certain type of charm that it oozed with. It had so much charm that it almost turned most of us into furries because of that Carmelita Fox. And then you had my favorite of the three, Jak and Daxter. The Jak series was actually very important, believe it or not, because once again, this is an era of games where Naughty Dog was about pushing boundaries instead of remastering past hits. For those of you unaware, the original Jak and Daxter was the first game to feature a seamless 3D world in a console video game. There were no loading screens between areas. You only had to load into the game and then you were good. This was a technical feat back in 2001 that's actually recognized by the Guinness World Record as the first console game with no loading screens in a 3D world. Jak took everything that made Crash great and it turned it up to 11. The world was bigger, the narrative was stronger, the comedy was funnier, and the large arsenal of weapons was awesome too. The best part is though, even though it's built on the foundation of Crash Bandicoot, Jak always paid homage to Crash because he even had the same spin move. Jak wasn't the only one doing dope stuff either. I mean, Ratchet had clever puzzles to mix up the gameplay, and the enemy variety was awesome too. Sly was great because it gave the player multiple characters to use, it had heists, and the thief abilities were always fun to pull off. These three went on a run, something akin to the Golden State Warriors dynasty, and that's why all three still hold a special place in many gamers' hearts. And because of that, all three have gone on to sell tens of millions of copies. But sadly, every good thing must come to an end. See, despite these three being great, one of these games did foreshadow what was going to happen in the third generation of platformers, which would eventually lead to the downfall of the genre genre as a whole.
I thought my homeland would receive me with open arms, but my only welcome was fire and arrows. Nothing in my kingdom is the way it was. Not even me. No more suffering. I can stop this! Stay back!
Towards the end of the PS2's lifespan, gaming went through this whole interesting transition. The 7th generation of consoles had arrived with the Xbox 360 and the PS3, the generation I've dubbed gaming's teenage years, so gamers were getting a little bit older, and because of that, we saw a shift in what the consumer demanded. Out were the cute heroes such as Spyro and Sly Cooper, and what was in were more mature, brutish types of protagonists. I first noticed this trend with Drac 2, which is basically just Grand Theft Auto for kids, and then the Prince of Persia went dark as well with the Two Thrones. The thing is, during this transition period, gameplay loops for single-player platformers were similar, but just with a darker tone and a little bit more focused on action. The pure platformer had died out in exchange for a fusion of different genres, and depending on who you were, you either liked it or you just moved on to the other thing that got popular during that era.
Shoot a gun, dog. Learn how to gun. You fucking riot shield. What else? Oh, riot shield. I'm a pussy that use riot shield. Oh, what do you want?
The 3rd generation of platformers gave us classics such as the infamous series, Prototype, and Mirror's Edge. You did have some traditional platforming games mixed in there, such as Little Big Planet, and Ratchet was still going as well, but this era was definitely dominated by edgelord content. And I think most of us would agree the best of it was the Infamous series. Infamous was great because it was designed by Sucker Punch, the same studio that brought us Sly Cooper, and in this game, you played as Cole McGrath, a bike carrier who gains electric superpowers after surviving an explosion caused by a package he was delivering. The city's put into quarantine and you fight against organized crime festering in the city. This game was cool because it had a morality system that changed the way Cole fought and the way that people perceived him. But more importantly, this game remained rooted in its platforming. All throughout your adventure, you are jumping on rooftops, gliding, and sliding on electrical wiring, all of which felt great, by the way. This series felt like a natural evolution of giving gamers something familiar, yet it was also new and mature. Prototype did something similar, but I think it's easy to forget it's a platforming game because I do believe there was a heavy emphasis on action before anything else. It still doesn't change the fact that you are jumping around the city like the Incredible Hulk, which was a blast, by the way. Other than that, if your name wasn't Ratchet or Little Big Planet, platformers kind of struggled in this era. Gamers were getting older and their interests were changing, so developers had to reflect that in their work to keep up with the times. If you couldn't find a way to make platforming cool and innovative, there was a high chance your game was going to be passed on by consumers. Not to mention, the early concept of live service games was implemented during this era. You had the introduction of things like map packs and story DLC that extended the life of a game well beyond what it would usually do. For the first time ever, gamers who were balling on a budget were tasked with choosing between a 15-hour single-player game or a potentially limitless multiplayer game where they could make cool friends like this.
Hey, you're just mad because I'll be able to do something with my hard hands that you'll never be able to achieve in your entire life, kid. So yeah, you're gay.
As time went on, unless you owned a Nintendo, platformers just became a thing of the past, a relic of a different era, and truthfully, I don't think it was necessarily a bad thing. There's a saying that goes, every good thing must come to an end, and I think that was just the case for this genre. I also think the death of platformers' popularity was sped up by market saturation. See, between the PS1 and the PS3 era, there were too many people trying to create the next Crash Bandicoot, and market saturation doesn't just affect the little guy, but the popular ones too, because too much can make everything seem uncool after a while. There was a serious lack of quality control during this era. I mean, for every Ratchet and Clank, there was a million Glovers, Toombas, and Vexes out there. Everybody and their mama had their own mascot back then, and people got burnt out because so many of them were not good, and the average person isn't made of money. Market saturation also meant that the industry cannibalized itself. Profits fell as these type of games began to dwindle, so it made it riskier to create one, thus the industry started looking for a new trend to hop on. Things got so out of hand at one point that Ubisoft made a platforming game about a damn bumblebee. But I can't front though, the theme song on the main menu was fire.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. Bum to the bum to the bum to the bass. Bum to the bum to the bumble. Bum to the bum to the bum to the bass. Bum to the bum to the bumble. Bum to the bum to the bum to the bass. Bum to the bum to the bumble. Bum to the bum to the bum to the bass.
As the years went on, you began to see less and less of the mascot platformers. You barely saw any of the edgier platformers either. Instead, PlayStation shifted their focus towards turning everything into these Oscar bait type video games with the same third-person over-the-shoulder camera like God of War 2018 and The Last of Us. Don't get me wrong, great games, but oh my god, give that formula a rest. The PS5 needs to find its own identity with its own unique IPs instead of the same rehashed ideas. And then live service games also became a thing too. I mean, why make a 10-hour platformer when you could release a multiplayer game for free with endless amounts of content and microtransactions to get people hooked into spending more than they ever would have for that $70 game? Although I do think that bubble is gearing up to burst because I mean, look how Sony did Concord. Long story short, between market saturation, gamers wanting different experiences, and corporate greed, it felt like the entire gaming community just woke up one day and said,
I don't want to play with you anymore.
As years would pass, the pickings for new platforms would become slimmer and slimmer. But every once in a while, you'd have a breakthrough like Super Mario Odyssey on Nintendo. Guacamelee held it down for the indie titles, and It Takes Two is a modern-day co-op classic that I cannot recommend enough. Titles like these showed 2D and 3D platformers still had legs in them so long as you did something refreshing with the genre and you marketed it right. And Sony did this with the launch of the PS5. They had a free-to-play title called Astro's Playroom. Astro's Playroom was a charming platformer that captivated millions with its low barrier to entry. I mean, the level design was immaculate. There was nods to PlayStation's history, use of adaptive triggers, the microphone, and more. For the longest, this was the only game that really showed off the full potential of the PS5 controller, and because of that, it garnered a cult-like following. Due to the success of Astro's Playroom, development for its sequel started shortly after the release of the original game. But this time around, the dev team had ambitions of going from some free-to-play downloadable to the next big AAA title, and it would seem they achieved that because the reviews have been glowing. Astrobot released September 6, 2024, and its current Metacritic score is sitting at a 94 overall average. Shadow of the Erdtree and Destiny's new DLC both reviewed well too, but understand that score makes Astrobot the highest reviewed full game of 2024 so far. That's an amazing feat considering I recall many of you complaining about the amount of screen time this game got during the last Sony State of the Play. Now everybody and their mama is on social media shouting Astrobot is a real man's game. And some of you might be wondering why. If that's you, well, I've got great news. I don't go by other people's opinions. I've been playing the game. So for this last section of the video, I'm going to share my thoughts on Astrobot, and before I do, quick disclaimer. The following video is not a full review. At the time of this recording, I have several hours on this game, so this section will simply contain some first impressions and general info on Astrobot. How I feel about the game now may not be how I feel by the time I reach the end, so feel free to take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. And with the disclaimer out of the way, here's everything you need to know before you install Astrobot. Astrobot is a family-friendly action platformer that's available now exclusively for the PlayStation 5. The story is fairly simple. Astro and the gang get into an accident in space and it splits up all the bots, so the player is now tasked with rescuing all the homies. This takes you on an adventure that's very reminiscent of platformer games from that golden era. Astrobot features 80 levels split across 6 galaxies and 50 planets. Each level has a certain number of bots that need to be rescued, and they can only be found via exploration. I think it's refreshing to play a game that returns to the format of level 1, 2, 3, and so forth. It allows the player to engage with the game while also respecting the player's time. It's just too bad you won't want to respect your time because once you pick up this game, it's hard to put it down. And that's because Astrobot sports top-tier level design. Levels are vibrant, charming, and they span across all different types of biomes. No two levels are the same, and each level introduces some type of new gameplay mechanic that kept things fresh. I am a huge fan of how each level had levels within the level if you really took the time to explore and dig what it had to offer. It's important to check every corner because often there are secret paths that lead to more collectibles needed to 100% 100% the game. And even if collecting isn't your thing, you're still going to have a blast because, well, you can emote. Yeah, guys, I'm not gonna lie, this might be game of the year, guys. Let's go! Ah! And then emote on that boy. Ah! And I got my best friend with me, got a dog. It's me and Aki. One thing that really surprised me about Astro is its heavy use of physics. It feels like almost everything is movable or alive in this game. And because of that, you're gonna want to touch everything and explore every inch of every level, as you never know what surprises it holds. Complementing that use of physics is also the use of the PS5 controller. Rarely do PlayStation games use every function in the controller, but Astrobot pulls no punches. Expect to do things that use the haptic feedback, adaptive triggers, motion control, microphone, and more. None of it feels like a chore either. Normally, motion controls annoy me, but in this game, it brought me joy. Oh shit! I'm making robot pizza! I'm having fun! One of my favorite features in this game comes after you complete a level. You're given the option to return to it and pay 200 coins to a bird to help you find secrets that you might have missed. It doesn't tell you exactly where the things are that you missed, but instead it beeps as you get closer. I thought this was a cool way to promote exploration and replayability. Using that bird made me appreciate the level design even more because I often caught myself thinking, man, that was a creative place to put something. It also helps the music in this game is top tier. By the time I reached the second level, I was already humming some of the game's music. I know it sounds goofy, but this game does these little things to put you in a good mood, and for me, that's what a game is all about, escapism. I couldn't help but stand up and hit my bankhead bounce to this banger. You said the beat hitting? Why everybody doing that dancing emotes? Oh shit. Now, if you're a fan of PlayStation or just games in general, you're going to love the fact that half the robots you rescue in this game are from PlayStation's rich catalog of games. Half the fun in this game is never knowing who you're going to run into. And what's cool is some will play a role in the story. The ones that don't end up staying at the hub world known as the Crash site. The Crash site doesn't just hold your friends either, but it also holds secrets and puzzles for people to engage with. The core gameplay loop of Astrobot reminds me of a mix between several classic games. The general platforming feels like a mix between Mario Galaxy and Mario Sunshine. All the gadgets, they remind me of Ratchet & Clank. The unique camera angles remind me of Crash Bandicoot, and the use of humor reminds me of Jak and Daxter. All of this is here while still managing to carve out its own identity thanks to the use of the PS5 controller's unique features. And all of the heavy inspiration this game carries is the reason I believe there's a meme floating around about Astro being the Mario Galaxy 3 that we never got. Just know the use of heavy motion controls could lead to some very freaky moments. Beating my with the controller. Look at this shit. What do we do? God damn, hell yeah. Overall, I'd say this game was pretty easy for platforming veterans like myself at the beginning, but since I haven't finished it, I can't speak on the later game. All I can tell you is that from what I heard, there are some fairly challenging levels later in the game. Matter of fact, it's not even what I heard. It's what I saw during my homie Siggy's live stream.
All right, let's make sure we fucking do this right. You gotta be kidding me!
I almost forgot to mention that this game is very well optimized. This is a game that runs buttery smooth on the PS5, and I can't stress enough how much that makes for a better experience. When it comes to games where you have to make tight and precise jumps, great performance is always welcomed in my book. Now, because I've been given nothing but a glowing review, I'm sure some of y'all want to hear my negatives for this game, and truthfully, I don't have anything terrible to say about Astrobot. This is a great game that draws inspiration from the past, but it still manages to put its own twist on it so it stands out from the pack. Now, this didn't bother me, but one thing I will say about the game is, for some, the price might be too steep for what you're getting. At launch, Astrobot retails for $60, and according to HowLongToBeat.com, the average playthrough takes about 12.5 hours, while a completionist run takes the average person 16. I think that's good bang for your buck, as I'm tired of all these 100+ hour-long games, but I know some of you might disagree. At bare minimum, I hope you found that information useful when making your decision to purchase it or not. If you couldn't tell already, I love Astrobot. I feel comfortable recommending this game, and I have yet to complete it. It's that good. I hope this game leads to a resurgence in the PlayStation mascot platformer, as I think the genre as a whole has been severely missed. I mean, Plucky Spyro is another unique platformer that blends 2D and 3D gameplay, and it just released and it's getting rave reviews, so I know people want more. Not to mention, there's an entire generation that grew up without these type of games, seeing as gaming went through this whole edgelord era. If platformers do see a resurgence in gaming, I just pray these studios find some type of balance. Learn from the mistakes of the past. I mean, 100 new platformers don't need to be released every year. Instead, find a balance with the number of releases you guys do, continue to innovate, and I think this once forgotten genre can carve out a niche in the gaming space. The same way China is carving out its own niche in the gaming space with Black Myth Wukong. I did a whole deep dive in why I believe China's gearing up to make a major push in the gaming industry, and if you want to know how they're going to do it, do me a favor and click the card on the screen to learn more about the unbelievable rise of Black Myth Wukong.